my plan for today was to demonstrate how we use it in addition to our donor suite. So demonstrate our hybrid setup using both the donor suite, which is the current usage. Most of you are probably more familiar with the cadaver lab. It's the same thing, as well as the Anatomage. And then illustrate the value of utilizing both in the classroom. There are major advantages to both of them together, and I realize that some can't have them together, but I'll demonstrate how I've used this both in upper division graduate medical education and as a supplemental education as a recruitment tool to our local school districts to recruit folks into the college system. And some tips to adapt it to all age groups. I've literally taught from preschool to elder hostel. And that picture on the left actually is my daughter when she was 4. And she used to say, "Daddy, can we go to work today? And so I can see the inside of Emma." Emma's her German Shepherd. It was not that much smaller than the Anatomage table. And so she'd go, "I want to see what the inside of Emma looks like." And so I'd have to put her on a chair so she could reach the table. But there is so much education that can occur for young people as well as graduate level education. And it's a beautiful system. So let me show you the setup that I'm working with. As you can see on the right, we have a pretty much state-of-the-art donor suite or cadaver lab. We have OT, PT, PA, and dental programs, both based in Pocatello, Idaho, but also as well in Meridian, Idaho. And so what you can see up on the right there is we have all these screens, and those are individual cameras that can project down. And so we can project back and forth across the state. But obviously, this is not inexpensive. And of course, if you're going to have these, you have to have a cold room where we have all of our specimens and our donors. And so we're looking at a very significant expense. Plus, there are some age groups that it's inappropriate and in some cases not legal to allow access to this. In some states, you have to be enrolled in that institution to have access to these. So we added to this system our Anatomage table. And fortunately for us, the Anatomage room happens to be just across the hall from our donor suite. And so we put in the table. I quickly learned that it's beautiful for 4, 5, 6, 7 people close up working on it. But if you get 20 or so, it's a little bit tricky. So I installed 2 4K monitors, which you can see the obvious cabling there. And now we can get 20 or 30 at a time. And honestly, the resolution on these monitors is so good. It actually is fantastic for teaching. And then it became really popular in outreach education. And so the first thing I noticed about the Anatomage tables, there's wheels on it. And I got a little nervous about moving the table around. And then I realized, well, there's probably got to be wheels on it for a reason. So we have this huge outreach where it's called Experience ISU, where this massive amounts of students come onto campus to learn about the university experience. So I moved it down into the Student Union ballroom. That's not a very positive picture of myself, but whatever. And there's probably 300 people in this audience. And you can see I hooked it up through the HDMI cables to 2 different projectors on the 2 different giant screens. And you can get it into very large groups of audiences. And I got to tell you, the table's pretty durable. I've moved it quite a few times now, and it has held up monumentally well. All right. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of some teaching ideas. I don't think you're going to learn any new techniques about how to use the Anatomage table, but more to the point of how to adapt it to different stories, to different age groups. The picture on the left is kind of bizarre, I get it. This happens to be one of the most recent ones I did. This was Science Trek, where kids come in through the Idaho Museum of Natural History, and I bring them in and show them various versions of the Anatomage table. So what I'm going to do is show you a little bit and then discuss it as we go through it on some various ways that I've used the Anatomage table through some hands-on experiences. So let me click on that.
Hi folks, hopefully I got this set up right. I just wanted to spend a few minutes showing you how I use this across multiple platforms and multiple age groups. I'm not going to show you any fancy technology about how to utilize the table in a radically different way, but rather more of a pedagogical attempt to show you how I've used it across many, many different age groups, literally from pre-K to what's known as New Knowledge Adventures, which some of you may be familiar with the Elder Hospital. Literally, the technology is pretty simple. In addition to the Anatomage table, I've already mentioned our high-res video camera or video monitors. I literally bought a $50 Inatech camera USB that plugs into the back of the Anatomage table and installed Zoom on the table. And when the pandemic hit, I discovered I could literally Zoom to the local school systems. And so I did a lot of Zooming on the table in the last few years. But now we get a tremendous amount of age groups that come into our department with a lot of attention and focus on recruitment and retention, meaning bringing students in and teaching them about what we do here. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some issues with using the donor suite of Cadaver Lab that not all age groups can have access to that, nor should they. And I've already talked about the advantages and disadvantages of having either or, but I've also talked about the advantages of having both. And I'll just kind of wander through some age groups to show you a few odd ends. Now, I get a lot of TK through 3 age kids coming in. And in fact, you saw a picture earlier on the top of my daughter when she was 4 playing on it. And there is definitely a wow factor. When you start rotating things, they get kind of impressed. Well, that's a 6-year-old. But I don't tend to teach a tremendous amount of hardcore anatomy, but rather I teach functional morphology. For example, I'll ask them, I say, okay, close your eyes and point your index finger at your nose. Well, they can all do that, of course. And so how do we do that? So we can learn that from the Anatomage table. So first of all, let's look at what we're dealing with. There's a bone. And they say, what's the name of the bone? I said, don't worry about it. And I very seldom name the bones right off the bat. Because at the age of 6, who cares? What we can learn from this is we'll put a functional morphology. I'll say, okay, take a look at the shape of that bone. And there you see at the back of this bone, this big round concave surface. And what do you think that's for? And they say, it looks like a joint. I say, yeah, it is a joint. And it rotates over another bone, this bone right up there, known as the humerus. And it articulates with that bone down there. And guess what it does? It doesn't take long for a first or second to realize, oh, it allows your arm to move in this direction. And I say, okay, great. We're halfway there. Now what I want you to do is move your arm up and then rotate at the same time. How do you think we did that? And they look around and then they quickly realize, oh, there's 2 bones in the forearm. Let's take a look at that one. And you'll realize that it's very symmetrical on both ends. There's no real knots like there is in the other bone. And there's not a direction to the joint. And it doesn't take long for them to figure out. But if you look at the connection between the humerus with the ulna and the radius, then it allows us to rotate our arm. Now, at this point, other than what I just said in the last sentence, I haven't told them to name anything. But I taught them some function. using basic anatomage systems. And then we'll wander through a little bit with the nervous system and the cardiovascular system, and we'll look at heart and a few other things later. But the idea is, in my opinion, is as I dedicated a book recently to my daughter, I said, remember, there's nothing more important in life than curiosity and creativity. And if this kid solved creative and curiosity problems with looking at the joints of an arm, and certainly the Anatomage helped us to do that, I think we're starting to do our jobs.
So at this point, I just wanted to pause and go, okay, that was a really dumb experiment, but it was really beautiful for 5, 6, and 7 year olds. But now you kind of got to play it by ear. If they get really interested in the joints, I'll go to the femur. We focus on ball joints. We'll focus on the knee. We'll look at the skull. It just kind of depends. But in my experience, most of the kids get really interested in all of these little squiggly lines down here. They want to focus on the nervous system or the cardiovascular system. So then sometimes I'll just take the skeleton away and we'll focus on the heart for a while, or we'll go straight to the brain. The thing with the youngest kids is just be very, very flexible in teaching and work with them. And then we'll continue on from here.
Most of my crowd, though, has been high school students, primarily through recruitment into college. At our state is 49th in the country for recruitment of college students. And so we bring a lot of college students in to say, look at what we can offer you. And you kind of got to make it appropriate for their grades. And I had over 2,000 students in the last couple of years that were high school age kids. And so I tried to make it appropriate for them. And I came up with a number of stories. I'll just give you one of them. For example, if we take our donor, put my muscles down. Turn him over. And we say, okay, here's the deal. Female high school age students have the highest incidence of lower back pain that's ever existed. It's become an epidemic of monumental proportions. And I'm going to use the Anatomage table to show you how to fix it. Can I show it to you in the cadaver lab, which is 10 feet away from where I am right now? Yes, but it's going to take me all day to do the section. And guess what? I can't undo the section once it's done. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how to fix that. And I usually start down with the gluteus muscle. The rear end gets a bad rap. Incredibly important for stabilizing the lower limbs, especially the IT band, which you can see running right down there, and the lower back. It's also one of the biggest cause of back problems. And so I asked these folks, I said, let's look at these muscles. Let's take them apart one at a time. There's your gluteus maximus. Huge muscle, stabilizes lower end, lower back, incredibly important. And then next to that is the gluteus medius. We get rid of that. We can put labels, but I often don't at this point. I don't want them to worry about having to memorize stuff. And then next to that is that weird little pyramidal shape, semi-pyramidal shape, if you ever got an affirmation, called the piriformis muscle. The piriformis syndrome is the single biggest cause of lower back problems. Let's get rid of it. That's what's underneath the side again. And the students are going, yeah, who cares? So I then usually ask these high school students, I said, all right, ladies, where do you typically carry yourself from? And they will say, back pocket, because front pockets are pretty bad. Right. You're sitting on your phone. It's called piriformis syndrome. Get it out of there. And usually about this point, about 50% of students will reach out in the back and pull their phone out and set it down. And I said, guys, you walk into an orthopedic specialist with a back issue, first thing he or she's going to ask you is, where do you carry your wallet? You carry your back front. So stop it. And then I said, that's what's great about this. I can just fix your back problem for free in 45 seconds on the Anatomage table. But guess what? I can put us back together too at the same time. So now let's go back here. Let's take the muscles away.
So usually at this point, the students are fascinated with the nervous system, and especially high school students who are interested in athletics. And the discussion inevitably goes to concussions. I- because they're football players or athletes or cheerleaders or whatever. And so sometimes I'll diverge completely away from Carl on the table to go straight to the brain. But oftentimes I'll go back and we'll discuss form and function of the skeleton and the function of the nervous system. So we'll just continue on from here.
And sometimes you want to change the color. That's really easy if you haven't figured this out yet. Let's just think great, but this will do better. We're just looking at these guys. And I did a continuing ed, I don't know, 6 months or so ago, to a bunch of first responders, primarily EMTs. And I said, okay, so this was a continuing ed time. And I said, okay, great. You were called into a car accident, massive chest trauma, and you had a pneumothorax, had a completely collapsed lung. So you got to get that lung in place. What do you do? And they said, oh, yeah, we do it. Thoracotomy, and we put a needle in and try to inflate the lung. I said, yeah, I know that. Where do you put the needle in? Oh, in the rib cage. I said, I know that. Where? Or sometimes somewhere between 4 and 5. So that's great, but where between 4 and 5? I don't know. We didn't talk about it. I said, well, let's think about it. So let's take the skeletal system away. And the first thing you'll notice is the nervous system and the cardiovascular system run almost entirely in parallel with each other. It's a beautiful, beautiful system. In fact, it's obvious it looks like a human with nothing but the cardiovascular system and the nervous system involved. I said, look how it's nice and parallel on that rib cage. Now let's throw the skeleton back on it. And what you'll see is the cardiovascular system and the nervous system runs directly below each of those ribs. So you don't want to risk hitting one of those nerves, one of those small vessels. So you want to put that needle to inflate the lungs just above. And they all seem impressed because most of them hadn't ever heard that before. And I said, yeah, you know what's really amazing about that is I can undo it all. I can add everything back on. Could I have done that next door in the donor suite? Absolutely. It would have taken me a month to do that section. But I can teach more of these and more easily for these various different systems. Also, one of the other things I'll show you very briefly that I do a lot is I teach more biophysics oftentimes than I do regular anatomy.
So let's just take a pause for a second. I mentioned that last one was for continuing education. I've done a lot of continuing education for nurses, for veterinarians, and especially for veterinarians. The last few versions of the Anatomage table has a tremendous amount of non-human data on there. I showed you a picture of my daughter with that picture was Kobe the dog, which I dearly adore. I've used Kobe a lot. But we use it a lot for continuing education. Those just happen to be EMTs, and that was one example. But for refreshing nurses, dentists, all sorts of other groups, it's been incredibly useful for that.
And I'm a big fan of, for some reason, you got to touch it just the right place. Really click it. Let's click that again. And now we turn it upright. And now we can scale through the body. And some things you can kind of bring up on the fly, like when you get up into the upper torso. Geez, I wonder why it's called a bicep. There's two giant heads. And then I'll go into input and output leverage and talk about the biophysics of moving the arm by demonstrating why it's called bicep. But that's usually not always at the same time. But one of the common things to do good one, is I talk a lot about Fick's principle and Ohm's law and biophysics of moving fluids, and say, okay, we're in a closed system. We need to keep blood pressure the same throughout the body. But do you have different needs if you're going to go from the heart to the lungs if you're sitting inches apart versus moving blood to the head or moving blood from the feet back up? Yes, we do. Flow equals mass times acceleration. If the acceleration is roughly the same, and we've got to keep flow the same, the only thing different we can do is mass. So to increase pressure, we have to increase the mass that's generating the force. And where do we generate force? Of course, it's muscles. So you say, which of those two ventricles, and you can label it if you want to, and identify them, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if you look at the right ventricle, it's a lot thinner, a lot less muscle mass than the left ventricle. Why? Force equals mass times acceleration. To maintain equal amounts of force, you have to change the mass. It's also a derivation of Ohm's law. So there's lots and lots of different ways, and none of this should have been new to you guys, and none of this should be unusual. But I also teach clinical neuroscience. When you get up into the brain, the regular ones are pretty good, but they don't go into quite detail. But that's where we get into the high-res detail anatomy, and we can focus on the brain in much more detail. I'm not going to go to that right now because it takes too long. But the other thing I wanted to point out was I teach comparative anatomy and comparative physiology, and I've also done some continuing ed with veterinarians. And one thing I've learned is over the years, veterinarians tend to kind of forget some of the anatomy, and so I'll bring in some of the various cases. And what's kind of interesting, especially for my comparative anatomy class, is I never even counted them, at least 40 different breeds of dog skulls on this table. And you can kind of say, what's the difference between a pug and a Great Dane, for example? But the case study library is amazing, and I've used this tremendous amount of times. Recently, we probably used this last, which would have been me. Kobe the canine, I've used a lot with veterinarians because I'm not going to open them up for review of basic canine anatomy, and it's a very interesting way to do that. Gunshot wounds to the head, as a neurobiologist, I teach that quite a bit. Another case study that I like quite a bit is the conjoined twins. And the thing about this, if you haven't noticed it, the case studies are really thorough. I have actually opened the case study, printed it out, had the case study ahead of time, and then showed them this case on the table. And it goes into a tremendous detail of the exact anatomy, and this was post-mortem autopsy, of all of the details and why or why not it could have been the twins could have been separated. And it's very interesting to take a look at it. And what the students figure out, these are not kindergarten at this point. Now we're talking graduate level pre-med students. They will begin to understand, oh yeah, there's two hearts, we can split the liver. But guess what? One side has the small intestine, one side has the large intestine. Crocodile mummy is a fun one. And I've used it very anatomy quite a bit. You can see the gastroliths in the stomach and all sorts of interesting things about it. I don't pretend to know everything on the table like that. I've not been through 25% of it. But spend an afternoon or more, and the histology is remarkable. For example, when I teach upper division anatomy and physiology, I use histology people quite a bit. And the resolution I use, especially on high resolution monitors that I have in this particular classroom, is better than you'll see in most microscopes, certainly student grade microscopes. And you can have the students zoom in to the table, even if they're in the classroom sitting right behind me, and they can download these onto their laptop through the Zoom lecture itself. and they can get a good feel for it. And there is a tremendous historical collection that I have used. And it's easier to project these up on a two high-res monitor than it is to say, now look through that microscope. You see what I'm talking about? Now I can point it out for them. So that's been a real boon for me as well. The curriculum is not so bad either. There's some really interesting things in there. I haven't used it as much as I wish. And there are some great things on pathways and movement of blood flow through the heart. Heart motion is kind of interesting. I show that to especially the younger kids to talk about how blood flow goes through the heart. So just spend some time on this. And like I said, I had no intention of providing you with lots of unique, cool tips that you didn't know existed, but how to adapt this for multiple groups.
So that was just kind of a weird overview. I don't think you probably learned anything radically new, but you got to know your audience. And I'll give you another example. A couple of years ago, we had a retiree, and I was asked to team teach physician assistant gross anatomy. And so we literally assigned it to my friend taught the actual donor suite hands-on lab, which I still think is important because the students need to get a feel for tissues and the texture of skin and subcutaneous fat and just the hands-on experience of that. And then I took over the Anatomage side, and something really interesting happened. The students would be in the donor suite, take off their gloves, which I was adamant about because you don't touch my Anatomage table with gloves on, and then run across the hallway and verify something on the Anatomage table, and then run back and verify it on their donor. And the other thing that is nice that the Anatomage has that much of the donors don't is variation. I mean, let's face it, who comes into the donors they're usually older folks, and there's a very high percentage of cardiac ventricular hypertrophy. You see a lot of aberrations, and we can see variation because we have 4 or 5 or whatever it is humans on the Anatomage table. So you can see variation and you can see differences, and students can verify simplistically in some cases on the Anatomage and then go look at the difficulty in some cases on the donor suite. And the high-res brains, because I teach clinical neuroscience, the high-resolution brains are a real godsend because, I mean, let's face it, I have a very limited access to the number of brains, of physical brains I've got. And so we can do a lot of dissections and then put them back together on the Anatomage table. On the other hand, to give the donor program some credit, I've learned there's one of the craziest things you can do with high school students is put gloves on them and put an honest to goodness real human brain in their hands. And then we talk about things like memories and perceptions and all these sort of crazy things. And then we move over to the Anatomage table and look at it in the hardcore anatomy. And that way I don't have to dissect the human brain because I only have a very limited number. And of course, depending upon the age group, do I want to put a real human brain in the hands of a 4-year-old? No. So it just kind of depends, but it has worked really well for us to combine the two. And I would argue with my outreach, I use the Anatomage way, way more than I use our donor suite. So to kind of summarize what we've been talking about, I illustrated my setup using a cadaveric system combined with Anatomage to create a pretty powerful teaching system. Having said that, I have praised the Anatomage for several regional schools that are junior colleges or community colleges who don't have millions of dollars to put in a cadaveric suite. And the reality of it is getting donors is a real pain. You almost have to have a faculty member whose part-time job is just to get the donors. And these junior colleges, community colleges can put the Anatomage table in, and it's easy to be able to teach off of that. And a cadaveric experience is neither appropriate or accessible for all age groups. It depends upon your state or the legal requirements. There are some requirements depending upon the donor situation that they must be a student enrolled in that excuse me, that university or college. Um, but the Anatomage can bypass all of that. And as you saw, um, kids of all ages get a big kick out of it. I will tell you though, the first time you put, say, a junior high school group on there and you want to try to teach them something, just stand back and let them play for about 5 or 10 minutes and then start teaching, because there is a very significant wow factor. And if you try to start out with just hardcore teaching, they're going to go, no, just let me play on it. And then so you get that over with, and then you can teach. Um, and there are simply things that can be taught in a short period of time that can't easily be done otherwise. That dumb exercise I showed you about piriformis syndrome, it actually is real world. And I've got a lot of those that I've done at the high school level. That's usually a common one, just because all these kids have cell phones nowadays. But the point is, you can undo it and you can undissect, and it's a pretty powerful thing to do. And also, you can deal with very large classroom sizes. It's not, look, trust me, I'm a technological idiot. And it didn't take me very long to figure out how to hook up HDMI cables to multiple projectors and multiple screens. And it wasn't long before I had this up to 300 people. It's very easy to do. And then when the pandemic hit, it turns out, which I didn't know at the time, you can just download Zoom and put it on the table, hook up a cheap camera, which you saw from those recordings, and you can Zoom it easily and you can send it out. So now, because this is a very rural part of the country, I've been able to reach some fairly remote classrooms by zooming in Anatomage. So it's been a big boon for us. Obviously, we're benefiting by the fact that we have a cadaveric program, but we're benefiting for recruitment and retention using that Anatomage table. But I will warn you, once people find out that you have one, you will get called repeatedly to come and accept high school kids coming in. I've got a huge College of Technology group coming in a couple of weeks because Curt has the cool toys. But once you can Zoom it, it reaches out quite well. So I hope I reached an audience that was appreciative of the ways you can get to various different groups. Just be very aware of your age groups and be very ready to change your plans. If I do an elder hostel group, immediately they want to go to Alzheimer's, no problem. Switch to the high resolution brain and we talk about Alzheimer's. Kids want to know what the heart does or the brain does. So just be very flexible in your teaching. But then with hardcore health professional students, it can be taught in a classroom setting. And you can set up tests and quizzes, which I've done quite often as well.